Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you all. I hope you've enjoyed getting your food. My name, again, is Peter DeVerne, and I have the great pleasure of hosting tonight. I'm a professor of international relations in the Department of Political Science. I also have the privilege this year of acting as the Director of Alumni Engagement for our department. And it's a true pleasure for me to have the opportunity tonight to host the 2025 Mark Zacher Distinguished Speaker Lecture. And this is, of course, to honor and remember Professor Mark Zacher. I'll say a few more words about Mark later in the evening. Tonight, we're very much looking forward to hearing from our speaker this year, Professor Jessica Chen Weiss. And to begin, I'd like to acknowledge that we are on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. And I'm now going to turn the proceedings over to Alan Jacobs, who is going to say some words of welcome to all of you. Thank you all very much.
Okay, thanks, Peter. I'm Alan Jacobs. I'm the head of the Department of Political Science, and I'm going to offer a very brief welcome because I know we're all eager to hear from our speaker, Distinguished Speaker Lecture. I really appreciate all of you taking the time out of what I know are very busy schedules to join us for this. This event, the Mark Zacher Annual Lecture, is really a signature event in our alumni programming. As many of you know, and some of you were there, we had a really great alumni dinner and trivia contest during homecoming weekend last September. We had a Politics to Watch event earlier this year, and it's really fantastic to see so many alumni, students, faculty, emeriti, and staff back again for this opportunity to connect, and I hope to see you at more of these events in the future. Keep your eyes open for the alumni newsletters and other communications you get from us. Thanks again, and back to you, Peter.
Okay, well, thank you very, very much, Alan. I appreciate those words of welcome. And again, as Alan said, I'm hoping that all of you will be coming out to many future events that we'll be hosting for alumni, but also for our faculty, for emeriti, for our students. And we're trying to increase suggestions, other opportunities to engage with us. Please do let us know. Thank you very much. Okay. So with that, I wanted to say a few words of thanks to Mark Zacher, a few words to remember Mark Zacher. Many of you knew Mark exceptionally well, as I did. Mark was a member of our Department of Political Science for almost 40 years. He ran our Center for International Relations for close to 20 years. And in many ways, he was the heart and soul of our IR subfield. Many of us remember him very fondly as a beloved colleague and as a very generous mentor and role model for many of his students. He was a particularly engaged teacher. He was one that always spent huge amounts of time with his students, had an open door policy with all of his students, and was also quite an extraordinary scholar. For those of you not aware, in 1989, Mark was inducted into the Royal Society of Canada for his scholarship. He was a particularly prominent scholar in understanding how and when and why international institutions facilitate global cooperation. And of course, today we know with the world order being disrupted, we need Mark's voice. We need more and more people to understand how to facilitate global cooperation. Tonight we're going to hear from Jessica Chen Weiss, who's going to talk to us a little bit about ways to think about cooperation, things that are threatening the global order. And as we listen to Jessica tonight, I hope we think about Mark's scholarship and all that he did to help us think these problems, these issues through. This particular Mark Zacher Distinguished Speaker Lecture was launched in 2013. And each year the idea of this lecture is to bring a scholar, a leading scholar of the world, such as Jessica, to UBC to discuss cutting-edge issues in world politics. And this was made possible by the generosity of Mark's family, by Mark's students, and by his colleagues. They all came together to raise an extraordinary amount of funds to allow us to run this now in its 11th year. And again, it's to honor Mark's legacy as both a stellar academic and as a teacher. So with that, I'd like to extend a huge thank you to all of you here tonight who were generous with that, who helped set that up, who envisioned it, and thank you for 11 years of bringing people together here at UBC. So thank you all very, very much. And again, I hope as we listen to Jessica tonight that we continue to think of Mark and maybe even pull out some of his books and his articles off of our shelves after tonight's lecture and reread a few of those. I should just say before I leave Mark, one of the things is I'm a professor of global environmental politics. That's my specialty. And even to this day, Mark is considered to be a founding member of the group of us who started the idea of studying global environmental politics. He did a lot of work on oil tankers and trying to understand the issue of how to control oil pollution from oil tankers and the way global institutions and cooperation could lead to better protection of our oceans. So still considered a real founding figure. Okay, with that, it is now my true pleasure to introduce our Mark Zacher Distinguished Speaker for 2025, Jessica Chen Weiss. Jessica Chen Weiss is the David M. Lampton Professor of China Studies at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies and a non-resident senior fellow at the Center for China Analysis at the Asia Society Policy Institute. She specializes in global security, foreign policy, and Chinese politics, bringing together these three fields to create incredibly important, significant, and valuable insights into understanding international relations. She was named one of Prospect Magazine's top thinkers for 2024 and has an extraordinary number of publications, including she is a regular contributor in the journal Foreign Affairs, which is widely considered one of the most influential policy journals, particularly influencing US politics. I'd be curious to hear more about how much she's been publishing in that journal, but it's really an extraordinary achievement. She's also the author of many journal articles. I won't go through the long list of publications that she has in various prestigious journals, but I will mention her very important and powerful book called Powerful Patriots, Nationalist Protest in China's Foreign Relations. This was published by Oxford University Press, and please feel free also to read that after tonight's lecture. Now tonight, we'll move on. Jessica will be speaking to us, as you can see, on the topic of a world safe for autocracy, the domestic politics of China's foreign policy. And with that, please join me in welcoming Jessica to the stage. As Jessica comes up to do her keynote, I'll let you all know that she's going to speak for roughly 40 minutes, and then we're going to have the opportunity for about 15 to 20 minutes of Q&A with Jessica after her talk. So with that, over to you, Jessica.
All right, thank you, Peter, so much for that kind introduction, and to all of you for being here tonight. I think especially, given the geopolitical rift that is opening between our countries, it's all the more meaningful to be here as an individual, as a scholar, as a fellow, member of humanity, shall we say, and that I hope that regardless of what transpires between the United States and China or the United States and Canada, that we can always continue in this sort of people-to-people, academic-to-academic, scholarly exchange, as I fear our future depends upon it. Are we okay on the audio? There's a little bit of a ringing.
I know, that's what I was trying to figure out.
I wonder if I move this over here. Is that any better? No, it's about the same. Fine. Let me see if I move this a little bit, it helps.
Can I have a suggestion?
How is this? A little
Change.
further?
We could also give you my mic, which is working
Oh.
really well.
Okay.
No,
Is
I
that-
think that moving it down.
Moving it down is
needed.
helpful?
Yeah.
Okay.
It's still
Still ringing
there's
a
still a
little
little ring.
Let me know. How is this? I don't want to overpower you, but I also don't want you to not be able to hear.
That seems better.
Okay? Okay. Okay, great.
You fix it, Jessica.
Okay, very good.
Sorry about that.
No, not at all, not at all. So I'm pleased to share with you a little bit today about my forthcoming book with Oxford University Press entitled "A World Safe for Autocracy? Domestic Politics of Chinese Foreign Policy." And in the United States, there's an increasingly prevalent view that the United States and China are in the foothills of a new Cold War, already perhaps in one, or in something like an extreme competition to win the 21st century. And in this view, China is a revisionist power that seeks to displace or replace the United States as the preeminent global power and overturn what was once referred to as the liberal or rules-based international order. That view is maybe the revisionism is still there and the characterization perhaps a little bit less on the rules-based international order. But that view of China as a growing threat, potentially even an existential one, had largely eclipsed prior optimism that China could be peacefully integrated into the existing system as a stakeholder into existing norms and institutions. And in this view, actually, it was more that China was failing to contribute enough to the global system, to global governance challenges like climate change or nonproliferation. But in recent years, I think we've seen far greater variation than any of these simple bumper sticker slogans like revisionist stakeholder or free rider implies. Get a bigger say for China in organizations like the International Monetary Fund, while in other cases China has sought to advance its interests outside of existing institutions, sometimes by setting up parallel or complementary institutions like the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. And at still other times, China has rejected the standing of international institutions like the ruling of an international tribunal on China's claims in the South China Sea. And so, if putting this all together, I think there's a lot more variation that we still need to explain and also to understand where it might be going. An important academic article by Harvard scholar Ian Johnston laid out some of this variation, not just in how China approaches the international order, but also in the way the United States has supported or opposed various pieces of the international order. I don't expect you necessarily to read the fine print there. What's important to take away, at least as of 2019, was that there was variation. In some cases where what China supported, the United States supported, such as the United Nations system, the UN Security Council, even the WTO. But in other cases, there was sort of overlapping disagreement. And I think it's important to note that in just a space of a few years, a lot has shifted. No static depiction of whether it's the United States or China's approach to the international order can really capture this evolving landscape. And so it's really trying to understand the sources of variation in China's approach as well as how it is evolving over time that my book seeks to enter the conversation. And I think that mapping this contested and evolving landscape of Chinese preference is an important step to determining where and how China will seek to use its growing power to reshape existing norms and institutions, where it will be more flexible and potentially willing to compromise, and importantly, to what extent international pressure can help shape China's choices given its domestic politics. So my starting premise in an article that I wrote in Foreign Affairs encapsulates this, is that the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party leadership, is first and foremost interested in surviving. It's one of the few remaining communist parties that is still in office today, and the CCP has been deathly afraid of going the way of others. So its overarching goal is regime survival in a world that is safer for autocracy, but survival for an authoritarian party today is not just about using the tools of repression, it's also about performance and persuasion. It's about providing bread and circuses to bolster domestic support. The crux of my argument is that two characteristics, centrality and contestation, help shape the possibility and pluralism of the domestic politics of China's foreign policy approach to any given issue area. So what is this? So centrality is the notion that the Chinese Communist Party leadership has relied on central pillars of nationalism, stability, and economic development to justify its continued one-party rule. Sometimes in Chinese, this is referred to as sovereignty, security, and development, 主权、安全和发展. And it's on issues that are linked to these central justifications like Taiwan, Hong Kong, and territorial disputes that China's leadership has been hyperactive in making demands and insisting on its preferences, such as in that case of the arbitral tribunal in the South China Sea, which invalidated China's claims. But on less central issues, whether that's peacekeeping or many issues before the United Nations, China has been considerably more flexible. So for example, under international pressure, the Chinese-led Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, AIIB, conformed to the practices on environment and social consequences of its policy, similar to development banks led by Western countries. So what this means is the greater the centrality of an international issue, the more pressure the government feels to perform, and that it's much harder for them to defy popular or elite expectations. Repression is always possible, but it's riskier. And what this means is that it's harder on these central issues for the government to make concessions, especially unilaterally, without suffering some kind of a potential domestic backlash. As a result, international pressure on these central issues is more likely to backfire, putting pressure on the government to be at least seen as defending its so-called core interests, pursuing more unilateral policies that in some cases might give it more leverage, but more often, I think, leads to a logjam and an effort by the government to either resist international pressure or go it alone, building its own like-minded coalition. Ultimately, this could provide bargaining leverage, but more often, I think, leads to greater conflict. But it's important to note that these central justifications for Chinese Communist Party rule, nationalism, growth, and stability, are often in tension with one another. Even under an increasingly personalistic, centralized authoritarian leader like Xi Jinping, there are tensions and trade-offs between these different objectives. What it means is that an issue that touches on one of these central justifications doesn't necessarily mean that concessions are impossible, but it requires sort of a countervailing central incentive to do so. So for example, Taylor Fravel, a scholar at MIT, has shown that the CCP has historically been willing to make territorial compromises with neighboring countries in order to gain cooperation with the neighboring country in order to shore up domestic control and stability in those frontier regions. I think China's changing stance on climate change and carbon emissions is another prime example of an international issue that has touched on these different central pillars. Economic growth on the one hand and public stability on the other. For many years, the Chinese government viewed international efforts to limit carbon emissions as threatening economic growth in China, and China for a number of years, especially at Copenhagen, acted as a spoiler on further progress. But then domestically, the air pollution became increasingly a source of domestic outrage, including the infamous airpocalypse. And as this mass and elite outrage became potentially destabilizing, the Chinese government shifted its policies, investing much more in international efforts as well as domestic efforts to clean up the environment and limit carbon emissions. Nationalist mobilization, which protests against the United States, anti-Japanese sentiment, something that I took up in my first book, is another example of an issue that's been difficult for the government to manage domestically, because on the one hand, allowing nationalist mobilization, protests in the streets, or angry sentiment online can showcase the government's and the country's resolve to not be pushed around, but it also could come at a cost or risk to domestic stability. So that centrality, contestation refers to the simple fact that in a country of 1.4 billion people, there is a lot of difference. There's a lot of divergence over whether it's interests and ideas about how to achieve even shared objectives. This map shows economic or even ideological differences. And so while China is indeed an authoritarian system and most actors inside China lack formal veto power, their unwillingness to go along or to comply, or potentially protest or disrupt, may still affect the leadership's decision-making, and certainly it can constrain the implementation of policies. In particular, and here I refer you to Professor Cheek's excellent work here, there's a lot of different narratives that I think constitute the kind of ideological landscape inside China. Fascinating work that I'll return to in just a minute. There's one Chinese scholar here, Yan Xuetong, that Marxism is the official ideology of the Chinese Communist Party, but it may have had limited influence on its actual foreign policy. That may be an overstatement, but nonetheless, there's a lot beneath the surface, more than meets the eye. And indeed, I don't think we can understand China's response to the outbreak of COVID-19 without reference to the domestic divisions between the central leadership and local governments. I'd argue that had the central government known earlier of the extent of human-to-human transmission, they might have acted sooner to contain the outbreak. But because local leaders wanted to quash potential panic on the eve of important local political meetings, it was too late by the time the national level government understood the scale of the program, of the problem. This domestic contestation, whether it's between central and local level governments or over different notions of how to advance the national or bureaucratic interest, means that the more of this domestic contestation we see, the more likely it is that the government is going to have a difficulty implementing and enforcing even top-level directives. So take, for example, China's environmental commitments. Local officials seeking to juice domestic local economic development have often resisted central directives to shut down the efforts of polluting firms and plants. And oftentimes, Chinese officials and industries have tried to game the system, again, trying to seem to comply with regulations, but nonetheless trying to advance their own interests in economic development instead. In addition, often the government will set out sort of the broad outlines of policies like the Belt and Road Initiative, right, which we've heard a lot about. But when we have a broad general direction set out, oftentimes domestic interest groups will then, almost by design, use those to pursue their own objectives, as my colleague Yuan An has noted. So if you put these two different dimensions onto one another, as political scientists and international relations scholars are wont to do, we have a 2x2 table here, suggesting that some issues which are highly central also are rarely contested. And on these issues, like on Taiwan or maritime disputes, territorial disputes, these are ones on which the government has placed typically a very high priority in its foreign policy, often acted unilaterally in resistance to international pressure. But sometimes these highly central issues are also quite contested, like cyber governance or climate change, trade, and exchange rates. But many issues are less central to the Chinese Communist Party's domestic legitimacy. And in some cases, there is heterogeneity or contestation. In other cases, there's not. Oftentimes, there are, cases like take the Iran nuclear deal, where China played an important role in helping to design a key reactor to reduce Iran's future plutonium output. But then you had a well-connected arms exporter still sending ballistic missile technology to Iran. So you can have these kinds of tensions or contradictions, you might say, that are really attributable to this domestic heterogeneity. But as I mentioned at the outset, no static 2x2 or depiction can really reflect the evolution and movement of issues across space. So to take an example here, the Chinese government has tried to increase the centrality of some issues in order to show resolve and dampen domestic dissent. So for example, when protests erupted in Hong Kong or the United States and China got into a trade war back in the first Trump administration, the Chinese Communist Party framed these as issues as part of a national struggle, reminiscent of the Opium War, the Korean War, all these protracted disputes in which China eventually could prevail. And in using this kind of framing and propaganda, the leadership has tried to build public support for enduring the costs of conflict and signal its intent to stand firm in the face of foreign pressure. But it's important to note that the government isn't the only actor here with agency. So many subnational actors have linked their demands to some of these central narratives in order to increase the likelihood that their interests might prevail. So for example, as China sought to enter the World Trade Organization some 2 decades ago, a whole variety of domestic industries and ministries and governments within China were lobbying for continued protection, some with some more success than others. And so, for example, the telecommunications industry and the Ministry of Information Industries, they succeeded by linking their demands for protection to worries about social unrest and the potential loss of Chinese sovereignty to foreign powers, rather than just saying they wanted to avoid market competition. Now, you may be wondering if the government can control or shape the narrative and actors within China are trying to appropriate the party line. How does any of this then affect Chinese foreign policy? What are the limits that an authoritarian state can mold popular sentiment, create and build upon these popular pressures in setting foreign policy? The core of the book's argument is that these domestic pressures are malleable constraints, that investments in ideology and nationalism, they set the parameters against which the government's performance is then judged. These parameters or metrics can be shifted, sometimes slowly and over time, but there are costs and risks to doing so. What this means at a very high level is that what China wants, so to speak, is a contested and moving target. But the framework that I provide here can help us identify the patterns that shape these domestic pressures that the government then faces in trying to navigate these competing objectives at any given moment. So Chapter 3 looks at concerns about security, including political and ideological security, and how those concerns have evolved with perceptions of domestic and international threats to the Chinese Communist Party's rule. Create a world safer for the CCP. Chapter 5 looks at how the government has managed these competing views operations in the Indo-Pacific. So I'll preview some of this briefly before returning to some policy implications and conclusions for the future of the international order. So most observers would agree that the CCP has felt existentially threatened by the most intrusive and liberal elements of the international order the United States once led. What that ideological insecurity has meant for China's foreign policy conduct and its ambitions. Some argue that the CCP's Leninist character fundamentally determines its global ambitions, that not just survival, that the CCP will rest at nothing less than dominance and the subversion of democracy. And these views place less emphasis on Xi Jinping, the current top Chinese leader, and more on the CCP itself as a Leninist regime that is supposedly playing a long game to blunt American power and eventually replace the United States as the most powerful state in the world, not only materially, but also ideologically. A second line of reasoning kind of reaches similar conclusions, but on the basis of Xi Jinping's beliefs rather than intrinsic features of CCP rule. So you have arguments about Xi Jinping as sort of an ideological man, where ideology is driving policy rather than the other way around. Now, a third strand of thought, which I largely associate myself, argues that these ideological differences exist but have been misconstrued or exaggerated in their importance. Of course, some dismiss ideology altogether and say it's just about material power, but others take ideology more seriously but say that its content has often been misspecified. So again, my colleague Yuan Ang has argued that it's not autocracy, but the more liberal improvisational practices within China that have been responsible for its explosive growth. And my other colleague, seems like an advertisement for Hopkins here, Ho Feng Hung, has argued that ongoing tensions between the United States and China are less from ideological differences than sort of an inter-capitalist competition, given how capitalistic rather than Marxist China has become. And so this set of perspectives, broadly speaking, sees much less of a coherent model for China to export, although, of course, things can always change. And so I'm building upon and extending this perspective in several ways. So first, I've argued that the CCP seeks a much less ideologically threatening environment, but has to balance that objective of security with these other important metrics of legitimation, including nationalism and development. And so even when authoritarian regimes make common cause on the basis of insecurity and a shared desire to insulate themselves against liberal universalism, these contending priorities, particularly development, can often exert a countervailing and constraining influence. So for example, I think a pragmatic interest in avoiding potentially crippling secondary sanctions has limited the extent of China's support for Russia's war in Ukraine, despite the close ties and reported rapport between Xi Jinping and Putin. And so rather than a static cage, I argue that ideology is both contested and pliable, made up of multiple strands woven together for the purpose of providing a greater legitimacy than any of these single strands alone. And so the CCP has really drawn from, selectively then, from a menu of overlapping and at times contradictory traditions, whether that's Marxism, Leninism, Confucianism, or even capitalism. And in recombining these different strands of ideology, think of the propaganda film When Confucius Met Marx, the party has really been quite adaptive and reactive, both to international and domestic threats. And the fact that this ideology or this ideological mix has been used instrumentally and strategically doesn't mean that it's unimportant, but it means that the party's actions and pronouncements don't, in my view, reflect a static set of ideological convictions. And indeed, I think beneath the party's continued emphasis on Marxism-Leninism, there's a lot of debate over what role China should play on the world stage. As leading intellectual Yao Yang has noted, even we don't believe much of what we say. And that the goal is not to defeat liberalism, but to say that what we have is as good as what you have. In another related vein, Jiang Shigong, self-styled apologist for Xi Jinping thought, has written that socialism is not an ossified dogma, but an open concept awaiting exploration, definition. And so, despite the growing role and emphasis on ideology in Xi Jinping's China, it doesn't provide an escape from these competing priorities and ideological traditions that he has embraced. What then does this mean for China's approach to the world? Certainly, this Chinese Communist Party has sought to challenge ideas that democracy lies at the end of history, or rather to say that China's a whole process, democracy, and more democratic than others. But, their rhetoric aside, some have suggested that the CCP would feel more safe in a world that was more populated by autocracies and less by democracies. And so the CCP might put its thumb on the scale. But I would wager that authoritarian regimes like the CCP have a menu of options to reduce the threats posed, in their view, by democratic contagion, and that those efforts to reduce ideological threat need not run through these kind of risky and potentially counterproductive efforts to change other countries' domestic systems of governance. And so while in principle the CCP might feel safer if the world were more populated by former communist single-party states, the CCP, so far at least, appears to recognize the costs and risks of trying to bring about that world. Take, for example, China's relations with Vietnam today. Even that shared communist heritage has had limited value in banking tensions over their territorial or nationalist disputes. So ultimately here, in order to advance China's so-called national rejuvenation, the CCP has pursued a much more ideologically agnostic approach, in my view, to dealing with foreign leaders and political parties. In many cases, the CCP has, in fact, bolstered friendly incumbents and blunted intrusive liberalism, but without seeking to topple democrats or install autocrats. Ultimately, I think China's efforts may be helping to consolidate authoritarianism where it already exists, not necessarily promoting its further wholesale spread by subverting democracy. And so I think this is not a distinction without a difference. I think China's activities are making it more viable to pursue authoritarianism, and to the extent that China's example continues to shine, it's strengthening its appeal. And certainly I think that China's leadership's efforts to intimidate critics overseas are having a corrosive effect on liberal democracy. But ultimately, the CCP's strategy does not appear to hinge on defeating democracy or installing like-minded regimes around the world, implying that there is still, potentially, room for coexistence between autocracies and democracies, and a potential détente in the realm of ideas about how countries govern themselves. Now, nationalism is also, I think, an important but evolving ideological force within China, again containing multiple and at times contradictory strands of thought. It's a source of contingent legitimacy, could bolster or threaten regime security depending on how strong the government appears to be in defending and advancing the nation's interests. But at the same time, it's a malleable constraint because it's not wholly independent of what the government says and does. I like to refer or liken it to landscaping, right? You can cultivate and selectively prune back the landscape of nationalism, but over time, as certain narratives grow deep roots, become entrenched, it's very difficult to renovate that landscape without a whole lot of hard work and time. And the government isn't alone in trying to shape what we might refer to as nationalist myth-making, although it's trying to steer the bounds of what is politically permissible. Mobilization. And in particular, I think it's important to note the government hasn't always chosen to give free rein to hawkish voices. In the past, it has devoted to preserve flexibility, manage risks of escalation, and signal reassurance. There's a lot of also variation in Chinese public opinion. Surveys show that Chinese attitudes are generally hawkish, with the majority of respondents endorsing greater reliance on military strength and viewing the U.S. military presence and reconnaissance in East Asia as threatening. But there's variation too, with internet users tending to be more hawkish, elites also, and across multiple surveys, younger respondents often being more willing to express their opinions. But then how much does this actually matter? Well, in a series of survey experiments that I and co-authors conducted, we found that the government, yes, indeed can buy themselves some wiggle room through tough rhetoric or bluster, but if they don't take tough action, they may still pay a degree of public opinion costs. And in particular, that when foreign governments like the United States carry out actions that are seen as quite provocative, we found a decrease in public support for the government's performance, especially when the government hasn't taken tough action to intercede. And so this I think has important implications, because we often hear that, well, authoritarian leaders can simply rally the public around the flag by undertaking some kind of saber rattling or at worst, a little war. But in fact, this research and others suggest that these rally effects are actually quite conditional on what the government does. The outcome here, not just something they can reflexively draw upon when things are going poorly otherwise. And it suggests that the Chinese government may be more limited in its ability to invoke these foreign provocations to build public support without also building tough pressure for tough action, despite the kind of propaganda celebrations of, for example, this character, Wang Wei, the pilot who in 2001 ran his fighter jet into an American reconnaissance plane, forcing a Mayday landing on Hainan in a near crisis that spanned 11 days. And indeed, if we look at the kind of real-time effects of US military operations as they resumed publicly in 2015 in the South China Sea, we found indeed an increase in public disapproval. It wasn't large, but we found an increase in public disapproval of the Chinese government's performance, which had sort of issued some vague warnings, but ultimately didn't do anything to intercede. And so these results suggest that while the Chinese government may engage in a lot of bluster, it might not be able to fully offset the public opinion costs of restraint in the face of these foreign military actions, particularly ones that are high profile, with a kind of an embedded media reporter there broadcasting the Chinese government's inaction to the world. And so over the long term, as the United States looks to potentially strengthen deterrence, it may have to be very careful not to have the unwanted effect of stoking a greater popular pressure in China for tough action. Fast forward to 2022, when Speaker Nancy Pelosi went to Taiwan, Chinese officials, told me that they faced a lot of heat domestically for not doing more to prevent her plane from landing, as some on the Chinese social media had demanded. So taking stock to what this all adds up for, particularly for policymakers wanting to know what kind of international pressure on China is likely to get results and what's likely to fail or backfire. In terms of the framework, if an issue is central and uncontested in this upper left-hand corner, I think foreign policymakers looking at China need to be much more careful about actions that provoke rather than deter. It's still possible to shift Chinese behavior on such issues, but we need to look for some countervailing but equally powerful central incentive for cooperation. Another way is to look for reciprocal actions that reduce tensions in a kind of moves towards détente, efforts to set bounds around actions that each side takes rather than forcing or demanding unilateral concessions on central issues. Where there's more contestation or domestic heterogeneity, there's a lot more space potentially for foreign policymakers to look to playing one domestic constituency in China off of another. Some years ago, I think this played a role in helping with renminbi appreciation, where multilateral pressure helped accelerate that revaluation, even if the Chinese government then had to sort of buy off or compensate some of the domestic losers, industries with subsidies and other preferential policies. And this kind of a strategy isn't about getting China to do something that's against Chinese interests, but about getting China to do something that's in the interest of some powerful domestic constituencies while minimizing the opposition of others. This is not always feasible, of course, because the relative balance of power amongst competing domestic interests may or may not permit this kind of a strategy. And in general, international pressure is much more likely to be effective on issues that are not central to the CCP's domestic kind of legitimation narratives. So taking stock, what does this add up to as we think about China's rise and the renegotiation, if you will, of the international order? At a basic level, my argument is that we cannot simply deduce from first principles or historical analogies how China is likely to behave. We need to look within China at its domestic politics to understand China's preferences, constraints, and how they might ultimately evolve. Punchline, there's no one China, and this book seeks to give voice to the pluralism and possibility that lie beneath the surface to shape China's foreign policy, to illuminate the unresolved tensions that lie beneath the surface of authoritarian rule and what this means for China's foreign affairs. China's trajectory isn't set. A lot depends both on domestic as well as international developments and how they interact. Neither global shifts in power or Xi Jinping's rhetoric can fully predict where China's foreign policy is headed. And for American and Canadian and other international policymakers, the book illustrates that international factors can still shape China's trajectory, but we need to understand first how those international pressures reverberate within China's domestic politics in order to do so productively rather than counterproductively. Now, of course, China's preferences are only one input into this renegotiation of the international order. The The United States and other powers, big and small, I think have a lot of agency here. I think a big open question, is whether and to what extent the United States will seek to overturn the system it built, an order that Secretary Rubio recently said is, quote, now being used against us. If there's flux and possibility in Chinese foreign policy, this framework very much suggests that there is flux and room for fluidity in American foreign policy, as we are all witnessing to our dismay. But I think what this framework also suggests is that it's equally not the case that there's a total incompatibility between American and Chinese visions of world order, if not today, then in the future, that this is a continually evolving mess, if you will, on both sides of the Pacific. Ultimately, China under the current Communist Party leadership favors a more norms of sovereignty, non-interference, and the primacy of the state and development over individual political rights. There are certainly aspects of China's rhetoric and behavior that are at odds with these principles, as many of you, I think, well understand. And so if China wants to defend a return to a more Westphalian system of mutual coexistence among sovereign states, it will need to do a lot to curtail what some might call the extrusions of sharp power into other societies. But of course, a lot on this domain will depend on shifting American conceptions of the national interest and its attachment, or lack thereof, to sovereignty. These changes, I think, are indeed very unsettling, but it also reveals just how much space there is for evolution, sometimes in a very short time span, that neither the United States nor China are monolithic actors whose preferences could be deduced from their position in the international system, or even from their ostensible regime type, autocracy or democracy. So if there's a silver lining in all of this, and we all need a silver lining, that whether it's in Washington or Beijing, I think it's important that we not resign ourselves to our fates, that together we could imagine and possibly bring into being a better future. Thank you.